was about 4 or 5 years old when my parents separated. Apparently it was a pretty bad divorce, but I was too young to really remember any of the nastier details. My mom won majority custody of me and moved us into a 2 small bedroom apartment out in Ohio. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was enough for the 2 of us while my mom got back on her feet. I had my own room, but I rarely used it. Most nights I'd end up in her bed. I think we both needed the comfort back then. Our bedrooms were at the end of a short hallway, directly across from each other. The apartment was on the first floor, and it was summer, so my mom often left the window in her room open to let in a breeze. The window was right above the headboard of her bed. I remember the thin screen and how it rattled a little if you pressed on it. One night I woke up suddenly. I don't know what initially woke me up, but I sat up and noticed our cat. He was sitting in the doorway of my mom's room, staring into my bedroom across the hall. Normally he'd be curled up with us in bed, so this struck me as strange. I watched him for a moment, thinking maybe he was hungry, and then watched him walk into my room and let out this soft meow. I turned to wake up my mom. I nudged her shoulder, whispering her name before she opened her eyes. "What's wrong?" she asked. I pointed toward the door, about to explain that the cat may need food. But before I could explain, we both froze. Standing in the doorway, backlit by the faint light spilling in from the living room, was a man. He was tall and very thin, wearing dark clothes. He wasn't looking at us. Instead, he seemed to be focusing on something in the hallway, like he was trying to decide his next move. I did not scream. I remember thinking it could have been my dad, but quickly realized that he was living in another state, and it couldn't be him. My mom reacted immediately. She grabbed me, lifted me out of bed, and shoved me toward the open window. Before I even realized what was happening, I was outside, landing on the grass below. It was only a few feet, but I remember the jolt when I hit the ground. A moment later, she climbed out after me. I remember her grabbing my hand and pulling me as we ran towards the street, and she started screaming for help. Neighbors came out and someone called 911. We stayed in the living room of a neighbor's apartment until we saw the cops pull up. When they did, they searched our apartment for a good 20 minutes, but came back out saying they could not find anyone inside. They claimed there were no signs of forced entry, which did not make any sense because my mom swore she had locked both the deadbolt and the chain on the front door before we went to bed. The only thing they figured was that maybe she had forgotten, though she was adamant that that wasn't the case. For the next few days, my mom was paranoid. She double-checked every lock, kept the windows closed, and even put a chair under the doorknob at night. I could tell she was trying to stay calm for my sake, but I caught her crying once or twice when she thought I wasn't looking. About a week later, she was cleaning the kitchen. There was a small closet next to the pantry that housed the water heater. We rarely opened it, but that day, for whatever reason, she decided to take a look inside. Tucked into the corner, behind some cleaning supplies, was a notebook. It was dirty and looked like it had been there for a while. She figured it could have been mine, and she opened it. Inside were pages filled with names, crude drawings, and strange notes. Some of the names were crossed out. Alongside the notebook was a pair of gloves and some gum wrappers. I don't remember all the details, but I do remember how scared my mom was when she showed it to the police. They came back, took the items, and asked a lot of questions. But in the end, there wasn't much they could do. They speculated that the man might have been hiding in the apartment that night, waiting for us to fall asleep. Maybe he'd been coming and going for a while, using the front door or even the window in my room, which we never used and often forgot to lock. My mom had terrible insomnia after that. She kept the lights on at night and started looking for a new place to live immediately. Within a month, we moved out. I don't think she ever really got over it. Even years later, she still checks every closet and locks every window, no matter where we lived. And as for me, I think I'm okay for the most part, but I still have the occasional nightmare of a man standing in my doorway. I remember even calling my dad shortly after all this happened, and he honestly couldn't care less of the danger that we were in. And it was heartbreaking to hear, but I am now more understanding as to why my mother left him in the first place. As for the guy who broke in, we never found out who he was or why he was in our apartment that night. This happened right before the Christmas holiday. I was lying in bed with my boyfriend, Jay. We weren't talking, just staring at the ceiling in the dark, sort of sleeping but also still awake, if that makes sense. He was on his side and I was on mine. For no real reason, it felt like one of those nights that I might have a panic attack, as I'm prone to them from time to time. Then, out of nowhere, Jay rolled over and hugged me tight. It's not unusual for him to do that, so I hugged him back, but something felt wrong. Almost instantly, this overwhelming feeling of dread hit me like a ton of bricks. I don't mean nervousness or even fear. It was deeper, more primal, and it was like my body was screaming at me that something was wrong. Jay has always been warm, physically. He's one of those people who seems to radiate heat, but even in his arms, I felt freezing. I started to feel more anxious, more paranoid, like something in the room itself wasn't right. It was like when you know someone's standing right behind you, even if you can't see them. My eyes kept darting towards the corner of the room, the one farthest from the bed, even though it was pretty much pitch black. Finally, I couldn't take it and said, "Jay, do you feel that?" He looked at me and said, "Yeah, why is it so cold in here?" I explained how nervous and anxious I was feeling for no reason at all. Jay grabbed his phone and said, "I'm calling Matt." Matt was one of his friends who was studying to be a youth pastor. Jay put the call on speaker, and when Matt picked up, Jay immediately told him what was going on. Matt did not hesitate. He said, "Let's pray," and started talking right away. I got up, turned on the lights, and sat back down on the bed. I did not know what else to do, so I just closed my eyes and listened. Matt's voice was calm and steady, and for a moment, I thought it might actually help. But as he was praying, I swear the room dropped another 10 degrees. Like, it was so cold I could even see my breath. When the prayer ended, we stayed on the phone for a bit, talking to Matt, mostly about what had just happened. Then Matt asked, "Were you guys talking while I was praying?" Jay and I exchanged a look. "No," Jay said. "We weren't talking at all, just listening to you." Matt paused. "I heard something," he said. It was a deep voice, gravely, and it said, "Stop." None of us could explain this. After we hung up, Jay grabbed his things and said he needed to go home. He did not say why, but I could tell he was freaked out. I was mad, honestly, that he left me there alone, because I was honestly terrified. I ended up going to my dad's room. He was half asleep, but I told him what happened. His response, "If something comes in here, I'll grab my gun and shoot it." That was it. He rolled over and went back to sleep. I slept with the lights on that night. Nothing else happened, but I couldn't stop wondering, what was it? And why did it leave so suddenly? I was raised Christian, and I do believe it may have been some sort of demon or evil entity. Since then, I have 2 Bibles in my room, a crucifix, and have learned protecting prayers. I used to work in a nursing home as a CNA. It wasn't my first choice for a job, but it paid the bills, and I did like helping people out. Over the years, you learn a lot about patience, caregiving, and unfortunately, loss. But there's one thing I learned that still keeps me up at night. You can't always explain what happens in those quiet, in-between moments. One of the residents I cared for, Mrs. Baker, was a sweet woman in her 80s. She had dementia, but still had moments of clarity. One afternoon, I was helping her to her room, and we needed to take the elevator. She flat out refused. She looked terrified, gripping pretty aggressively on my arm. I asked her what was wrong, and she whispered to me, "I don't want to see that little boy." At the time, I thought it was just another dementia-fueled delusion. I reassured her, saying there wasn't a little boy, but she was adamant about it. We ended up taking the stairs, and she did not say anything else about it. I wrote it off until a few days later when another resident, Mr. Harris, stopped me in the hallway. He wasn't confused or forgetful like Mrs. Baker. He was sharp. He did crossword puzzles every morning and could recall the names of his kids and grandkids without hesitation. That day, he came out of his room and asked me, "Do you have any candy for the little boy?" I did not know how to respond. I asked what he meant, and he just laughed and said, "He was here yesterday. Nice kid. Said he likes chocolate." That night, after my shift, I called my mom. She had been a charge nurse at the same facility for over a decade, and I figured if anyone knew about the little boy, it would be her. I expected her to laugh it off or say it was just the residents' imaginations. Instead, she paused and said, "You've seen him too?" I told her I hadn't seen anything, but a few of the residents had mentioned him. That's when she told me the history. For years, residents, whether they were fully lucid or deep in dementia, have reported seeing the same little boy. They described him as having black hair and being about 8 or 9 years old. He always wanted to play, and sometimes he asked for candy. And the detail that really shook me, he seemed to prefer people with poor vision. My mom said one blind resident once described him as a boy who lives in a tent and died when a tree fell on him. I did not know what to think because I was never one to believe in the paranormal, but I was freaked out. About a week after that, I was feeding a stroke patient named Mrs. Reynolds. She was paralyzed on her right side and needed help with everything. As I fed her, I suddenly felt a cold touch on my arm. It wasn't the air conditioning or anything like that. It felt like a small hand. Mrs. Reynolds turned her head slightly, smiled, and said, "Is that your little brother? He's adorable." I did not have a little brother. That night, Mrs. Reynolds passed away. I'll never forget her smile or how calm she seemed in her last moments. I don't know who or what that little boy was, but after that, I started taking the stairs.